It was an ordinary afternoon in the bustling city of Denver, where life moved at its own relentless pace. People hurried down the sidewalks, engrossed in their phones or conversations, barely noticing the world around them. The air was crisp with autumn leaves scattering across the streets, painting the city in shades of amber and gold. Amid this picturesque scene, a moment was unfolding that would shock the nation and leave everyone questioning their own assumptions. James Carter, a well-dressed black man in his early 50s, strolled leisurely down a quiet street. He carried himself with an air of confidence, a calm assurance that only someone used to navigating life's challenges could exude. His tailored navy blue suit fit perfectly, and the polished shoes on his feet shone under the late afternoon sun. James wasn't just anybody. He was the newly elected governor, a man of integrity and vision, respected by those who knew him. Today, however, he had decided to leave his security detail behind, choosing to enjoy the city as an ordinary citizen, blending in without the weight of his title. As he walked, James noticed the subtle glances from passers-by. Some looked surprised, others curious, but he dismissed it as nothing out of the ordinary. After all, he was a public figure, and people often recognized him. What James didn't anticipate, however, was how quickly the day would take a dramatic turn. 2 police officers in a squad car pulled up alongside James. One of them, a young officer with a buzz cut, rolled down his window and called out, "Hey, you stop right there." James paused mid-step, surprised but compliant. He turned toward the officers, his brow furrowing slightly. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. The older officer, a gruff man with a thick mustache, stepped out of the car. His eyes scanned James from head to toe, suspicion evident in his posture. "We got a call about someone walking around here without permission," he said, his tone accusatory. "Without permission," James repeated, his confusion evident. He gestured toward the bustling street. "I'm just walking. Is that against the law now?" The younger officer joined his partner, holding a clipboard. "We need to see some ID," he demanded, his voice sharp and unwavering. James sighed, reaching into his jacket pocket. He was accustomed to being questioned. He knew all too well that appearances mattered, and in some cases, his skin color drew more attention than his achievements. He handed over his ID, watching as the officers scrutinized it. "This says you're James Carter," the older officer said, his tone skeptical. "You expect us to believe you're the governor?" James' lips twitched in a faint smile, but he didn't argue. "I'm not expecting anything, officer. That's who I am." The officers exchanged glances, their disbelief evident. To them, it seemed impossible that a black man walking through this neighborhood in a suit could hold such a position of power. The older officer handed the ID back with a scoff. "Well, if you're so important you can prove it," he said, crossing his arms. "But first, we've got a little job for you." Before James could respond, the younger officer pointed to a trash can that had been knocked over, its contents strewn across the sidewalk. "Pick that up," he ordered. James blinked, stunned. "Excuse me?" "You heard him," the older officer said, his voice firm. "Clean it up. Prove you're not here causing trouble." A tense silence hung in the air as James stared at the officers. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, he considered pulling out his phone to record the interaction, but he hesitated. This wasn't about proving anything to these men. It was about standing up for himself and the principles he believed in. As James bent down to pick up the scattered trash, a small crowd began to gather. People whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unease. James knew this moment would likely make headlines, but he also understood the power of composure. He wouldn't let them reduce him to anything less than the man he was. Just as he finished gathering the last piece of trash, an elderly woman in the crowd stepped forward. She pointed at James, her voice ringing out with certainty. "That's James Carter, our governor," she declared. The officers froze, their faces paling as the realization hit them. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and phones flashed as people captured the officers' stunned expressions. James straightened, holding the bag of trash in one hand, his gaze steady and unwavering. The older officer stammered, "We didn't realize." James held up a hand, cutting him off. "I think you've said enough," he said, his voice calm but firm. He turned to the crowd, his eyes meeting theirs with quiet strength. "This isn't about me, it's about how we treat each other, remember that." And with that, James walked away, leaving the officers to face the weight of their actions and the growing crowd's judgment. As James walked away, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement, the crowd remained rooted in place, murmuring in disbelief. The elderly woman who had identified him stood tall, her voice rising above the chatter. "That's the governor, and these officers treated him like a criminal," she exclaimed, shaking her head in frustration. Her words only added fuel to the growing whispers, and the officers shifted uncomfortably, their authority now under the weight of public scrutiny. James didn't look back. His steps were measured, his posture unyielding, but inside his thoughts churned. He had spent decades working tirelessly to rise above stereotypes, pushing past countless barriers to reach where he was. And yet, moments like this reminded him how far society still had to go. It wasn't the first time he had been judged for his appearance, and he doubted it would be the last. But being treated like this while holding the title of governor, that stung deeper than he cared to admit. As he continued down the street, James thought about his upbringing. Born and raised in a small predominantly black neighborhood on the south side of the city, he had grown up watching his parents struggle to make ends meet. His father, a factory worker, and his mother, a school teacher, had instilled in him the values of hard work, dignity, and standing up for what was right. They had always told him, "You'll have to work twice as hard to be seen as equal, but never let that stop you." Those words had been his guiding light, pushing him through law school, years of public service, and a grueling campaign that had finally landed him in the governor's office. He had fought for his community, advocating for education reform, affordable housing, and police accountability. But moments like these, a simple walk turning into an unnecessary display of power, reminded him why the fight was far from over. As James approached his car parked a few blocks away, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was his chief of staff, Monica Daniels, a sharp and no-nonsense woman who had been his right hand since his campaign days. He hesitated for a moment, knowing she was likely calling about the incident. News traveled fast, especially when half the crowd had been recording on their phones. "Monica," he said, answering the call as he opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. "Governor Carter." Her voice was clipped, her tone a mix of concern and urgency. "I just got word about what happened. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," James replied, though his voice carried a trace of weariness. "It was an unfortunate encounter, but it's over now." "Over?" Monica's voice rose slightly. "James, there are videos of this all over social media already. The hashtag #GovernMoreTrash is trending, and people are outraged. This isn't something we can just brush off." James sighed, running a hand over his face. "I'm not brushing it off, Monica, but I don't want to turn this into a spectacle either. It's not about me, it's about the bigger issue. And that's exactly why we need to address it," Monica pressed. "You've spent your entire career fighting for justice and equality. This is the perfect opportunity to highlight the systemic problems we've been trying to tackle." James leaned back in his seat, staring out the windshield. She was right, of course. Monica always was. But the thought of stepping into the spotlight again, this time as the face of yet another incident of racial profiling, felt heavy. He had hoped his position would shield him from such indignities, but it seemed not even the title of governor could erase prejudice. "Schedule a press conference," he said finally. "Tomorrow morning, I'll address it then." "Good," Monica replied, her tone softening. "And James, don't let this get to you. People are with you. They always have been." After hanging up, James sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. He started the car and drove home, his mind replaying the encounter with the officers. He could still see their faces, smirking, doubting, dismissing him as just another man who didn't belong. The memory made his grip on the steering wheel tighten. When he arrived at his modest home, a sanctuary he had chosen over the grandeur of the governor's mansion, he was greeted by his wife, Grace. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of worry and determination. Grace had always been his anchor, the one who grounded him when the world felt too chaotic. "I saw the videos," she said softly as he walked up the steps. "Are you okay?" James nodded, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'm fine, just tired." Grace led him inside, where the comforting aroma of her homemade stew filled the air. "You've been through worse," she said, her voice steady, "but that doesn't make this any less wrong." They sat down at the kitchen table, and James recounted the incident, his words slow and deliberate. Grace listened intently, her eyes narrowing as he described the officer's actions. "You're doing that press conference, aren't you?" she asked when he finished. James nodded. "I have to. Not for me, but for everyone who's been in my shoes and didn't have the platform to fight back." The next morning, the press conference was held on the steps of the state capitol. Reporters and cameras swarmed the area, the air buzzing with anticipation. James stood tall, flanked by Monica and Grace, his expression calm but resolute. The crowd of supporters that had gathered cheered as he stepped up to the podium. James began to speak, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "Yesterday, I was reminded of a harsh truth, a truth that too many people in this country face every day. It doesn't matter who you are or what you've accomplished. There are still those who will judge you by the color of your skin before they see the content of your character." The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. James continued, his tone steady but impassioned. "This isn't about me. This is about the countless men and women who have been treated unfairly, who have been stopped, questioned, and humiliated simply because of how they look. This is about justice. This is about change." As James spoke, the officers involved in the incident watched the broadcast from their precinct, their faces pale with discomfort. They hadn't expected their actions to spark such a firestorm, and now they found themselves at the center of a national conversation. James ended his speech with a call to action, urging the community to hold their leaders accountable and to push for reforms that would ensure equal treatment for all. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the city. But as James stepped away from the podium, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The battle for justice was far from over, and he knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. After the press conference, the story spread like wildfire. News outlets aired the footage of James picking up trash under the officers' orders, the contrast between his calm demeanor and their blatant condescension sparking outrage across the country. Social media exploded with hashtags like #GovernalTrash, #racial profiling, and #JusticeForJames. The incident became a rallying cry for advocates of police reform, igniting debates in living rooms, workplaces, and even the halls of Congress. James returned to his office that afternoon, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The phones were ringing non-stop, his inbox flooded with messages of support, criticism, and everything in between. Monica sat across from him at the large oak desk, scrolling through her tablet as she updated him on the latest developments. "Civil rights groups are calling for an independent investigation into the police department," she said, but tone brisk. "The mayor's office wants a meeting with you to discuss damage control, and several community leaders are asking if you'll join their town hall next week." James leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered her words. "This is bigger than just one incident," he said finally. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to thrive. We can't let this moment pass without pushing for real change." Monica nodded, her expression serious. "I agree, but you need to be strategic. The department is already in defensive mode, and the union's lawyers are saying the officers acted within protocol." "Protocol," James repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "What kind of protocol justifies humiliating someone for walking down the street?" Monica didn't answer. They both knew the answer wasn't in the policies themselves, but in the bias that influenced how those policies were enforced. James sighed, his frustration evident. He had spent years advocating for better training and accountability, but the system was slow to change, resistant to challenges that threatened the status quo. Meanwhile, the two officers, Sergeant Harlan and Officer Miller, found themselves in the eye of the storm. Their precinct was swarmed by reporters, their names plastered across headlines. Harlan, the older of the two, was defiant in his response, insisting that they had acted appropriately. "We didn't know he was the governor," he told a local news crew. "We were just doing our job." Miller, on the other hand, was less certain. The backlash had shaken him, forcing him to confront the possibility that their actions had been wrong. He replayed the encounter in his mind, the look on James's face when they demanded he pick up the trash. It wasn't anger or defiance he had seen. It was disappointment, a quiet dignity that made Miller feel small in comparison. As the days passed, protests erupted across the city. Demonstrators gathered outside the police precinct, holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "End Racial Profiling." Leaders from various community organizations took to the streets, their voices amplifying the call for accountability. James, however, refrained from attending the protests directly. He knew his presence might shift the focus away from the broader issues and turn it into a personal crusade. Instead, James worked behind the scenes, meeting with legal experts, activists, and city officials to draft proposals aimed at reforming police practices. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with resistance, but he was determined to leverage the momentum of the moment to make meaningful progress. At the same time, tensions within the police department began to rise. Younger officers, many of whom had joined the force with hopes of making a difference, began questioning the culture they had inherited. Conversations that had once been confined to quiet whispers now erupted in heated debates during roll call and break-room discussions. One of those young officers, Maria Lopez, found herself caught in the middle. A recent graduate of the academy, Maria had joined the force with dreams of serving her community, but the incident with the governor had left her disillusioned. She had always looked up to Sergeant Harlan, but now she saw a side of him that made her question everything she believed about the job. Maria decided to reach out to James directly. She sent an email to his office, explaining her perspective and asking if they could meet. To her surprise, she received a response within hours, inviting her to a private meeting at the Capitol. When Maria walked into James' office, she was struck by how approachable he seemed. Despite the power he held, he greeted her with a warm smile and gestured for her to sit. They spoke candidly, Maria sharing her experiences as a young officer and James listening intently. "I joined the force to make a difference," Maria said, her voice tinged with frustration. "But it feels like the system is designed to protect itself, not the people we're supposed to serve." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Maria, but people like you, who are willing to speak out and challenge the system from within, that's how progress begins." Their conversation left a profound impact on both of them. For Maria, it was a reminder that she wasn't alone in her struggle. For James, it was a glimpse of hope, proof that even within a flawed system, there were individuals committed to doing the right thing. As the protests continued to grow and the nation watched closely, the pressure on the city's leadership intensified. The mayor, desperate to quell the unrest, announced the formation of an independent commission to investigate the incident and recommend reforms. It was a small step, but James knew it was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, however, forces were mobilizing to push back against the calls for change. The police union launched a public relations campaign, painting the officers as victims of a politically motivated witch hunt. Anonymous threats began targeting activists and community leaders, a chilling reminder of the entrenched resistance to reform. James found himself caught in the crossfire, his every move scrutinized and politicized, but he refused to back down. He knew the stakes were too high, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been marginalized, dismissed, or dehumanized. As the days turned into weeks, the city braced itself for what would come next. The independent commission prepared to release its findings. The protests showed no signs of slowing, and the nation held its breath, waiting to see if this moment would lead to real change, or if it would become just another chapter in a long history of injustice. For James, the fight was far from over, and the weight of that knowledge only strengthened his resolve. As the city waited for the independent commission's findings, the tension in the air grew heavier with each passing day. The streets were alive with protests, candlelight vigils, and impassioned speeches from community leaders. The media coverage had turned the city into a battleground for a larger national debate about systemic racism, police accountability, and the deep-seated inequalities that still plagued society. James had hardly slept. His days were filled with meetings, strategy sessions, and countless phone calls. Monica seemed to be in constant motion, juggling the demands of the press, legal advisors, and activists who looked to James as a symbol of hope. Every time he stepped outside, he was met with cheers from supporters, but also the stinging gaze of skeptics who questioned whether real change was possible. Behind closed doors, James wrestled with a deep unease. He had spent his career building bridges, trying to unite people across divides. But this moment felt different. The stakes were higher, the divisions sharper. The pressure wasn't just on him as a leader. It was on him as a black man who had become a living contradiction to the biases that had led to the incident. He carried the hopes of thousands on his shoulders, and the weight threatened to crush him. Meanwhile, the officers at the center of the controversy found themselves increasingly isolated. Miller had begun avoiding Harlan, their once friendly camaraderie replaced by tension and unease. Miller's guilt gnawed at him, and the whispers in the precinct about who would take the fall only made it worse. He had thought about coming forward, admitting that what they did was wrong, but the union's attorneys had made it clear any admission would mean career suicide. Harlan, in contrast, doubled down on his defiance. He appeared in a TV interview, his jaw set and his tone dismissive. "We were doing our job," he said flatly. "This whole thing has been blown out of proportion. The governor should have just said who he was from the start." The interview only fueled the flames. Protesters surrounded the news station, chanting for his resignation. The footage of James picking up trash played on a loop beside Harlan's unapologetic remarks. the contrast stoking public outrage. Across the city, murals of James began to appear on walls, depicting him not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience. One night, as James sat in his home office, Grace walked in with 2 cups of tea. She placed one in front of him and sat across the desk, her calm presence a soothing balm to his frayed nerves. "You're carrying too much," she said softly. "This fight isn't just yours to bear." James looked at her, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "It feels like it is," he admitted. "Every decision I make feels like it's under a microscope. If I stumble, it's not just me who falls. It's everyone who looks to me as proof that things can be different." Grace reached across the desk, placing her hand over his. "You've already proven that," she said firmly. "Now it's time to let others take up the fight too." Her words stayed with him as the week wore on. The independent commission had announced that its findings would be released at a public hearing, and the anticipation was almost unbearable. The city was on edge, with some fearing the report would be a whitewash, while others hoped it would be a turning point. The night before the hearing, Maria Lopez found herself unable to sleep. The young officer had been following the protests closely, her own conscience pulling her in conflicting directions. She knew what had happened was wrong, but speaking out against her own department felt like an impossible choice. Yet, as she watched videos of James' press conference and read stories about the protests, she felt a growing conviction that silence was no longer an option. Maria decided to act. Early the next morning, she sent a letter to the commission, detailing the conversations she had overheard in the precinct and the unspoken culture that allowed officers like Harlan to act with impunity. It was a risk, one that could cost her everything, but she knew it was the right thing to do. By the time the hearing began, the city was at a boiling point. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, their chants echoing through the streets. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. James sat in the front row, flanked by Monica and Grace, his expression unreadable. Across the aisle, Harlan and Miller sat with their attorneys, their faces pale under the harsh courtroom lights. The commission members filed into the room, their expressions somber. The chairperson, a middle-aged woman with a reputation for fairness, began by acknowledging the gravity of the moment. "This is not just about one incident," she said. "It is about the trust between law enforcement and the community they serve. It is about accountability and justice." As the findings were read aloud, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. The report detailed a pattern of biased practices within the department, citing not just the incident with James but numerous other cases where people of color had been disproportionately targeted. The commission called for sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training, independent oversight of police conduct, and new procedures for handling complaints. The crowd outside erupted in cheers, but inside, the atmosphere remained heavy. James listened intently, his mind racing. The report was a step in the right direction, but it was only the beginning. The real battle would be ensuring that these recommendations were implemented, and that they led to meaningful change. As the hearing adjourned, James stood to address the media waiting outside. The cameras flashed as he stepped up to the podium, the weight of the moment evident in his stance. But before he could speak, a commotion broke out near the courthouse steps. A small group of counter-protesters had appeared, their angry shouts clashing with the chants of the larger crowd. The tension escalated quickly, and James found himself in the middle of a volatile situation. The chaos unfolding around him was a stark reminder of how deeply divided the city and the nation remained. James knew that the road to justice would be long and fraught with obstacles. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was the fight of his lifetime, and he wasn't about to back down. The commotion outside the courthouse quickly escalated. Protesters and counter-protesters pushed against the barricades, their chants and shouts blending into a chaotic roar. James stood frozen for a moment, his hand gripping the edge of the podium as he scanned the crowd. His security detail moved in closer, urging him to step back inside, but he shook his head. "No," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "I need to be out here. They need to see that I'm not afraid." Before anyone could stop him, James walked down the courthouse steps, his presence drawing the attention of both sides. The crowd seemed to pause, a brief silence falling over the scene as people realized he was standing among them. Slowly, the protesters parted to let him through, their eyes filled with a mix of hope and worry. James raised his hands, signaling for calm. "This is not how we move forward," he called out, his voice carrying above the noise. "We're here for justice, not chaos. Don't let anger overshadow our message." For a moment, it seemed like his words were working. The crowd began to settle, the tension easing. But then, from somewhere near the back, a bottle flew through the air, smashing against the pavement just a few feet away from James. The sound was like a spark to dry tinder, and the crowd erupted once more. James's security team rushed to surround him, their voices urgent as they tried to usher him back inside. But James resisted, his eyes scanning the crowd. Amid the chaos, he spotted Maria Lopez, the young officer who had reached out to him, standing near the edge of the barricades. She looked torn, her hand hovering near her radio as she watched the scene unfold. Their eyes met, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Maria stepped forward, raising her own hands in a gesture of peace. "Listen to him," she shouted, her voice ringing clear above the noise. "He's trying to help." Her unexpected intervention seemed to catch everyone off guard, and once again the chaos began to subside. James nodded to her, a silent thank you, before turning back to address the crowd. "This is not the way," he said again, his voice firm. "Change doesn't come from violence. It comes from standing together, from demanding accountability without losing sight of our humanity." As he spoke, the crowd began to calm, the energy shifting from anger to resolve. But just as it seemed the worst was over, James noticed a figure moving through the throng, their face obscured by a hood. The person was moving quickly, purposefully, and James felt a prickle of unease. Before he could react, the figure stepped forward, pulling something from their jacket. A flash of metal caught the sunlight, and James' heart stopped. Time seemed to slow as he saw the object, a microphone, not a weapon, and realized the person wasn't an attacker but a journalist. The journalist shoved the mic toward James, their voice loud and demanding. "Governor, do you think the Commission's findings go far enough? Or is this just another political performance?" The question caught James off guard, but he recovered quickly, his expression hardening. "This isn't about politics," he said firmly. "It's about justice. And justice doesn't come from one report or one hearing. It comes from all of us committing to do better, to be better." The journalist didn't back down. "But what about the officers involved? Do you think they'll face real consequences? Or are they going to walk away like so many others before them?" James hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. He knew the answer wasn't simple. The Commission's findings were damning, but the system was still stacked in favor of those who wanted to maintain the status quo. Justice, real justice, would take more than public outrage or political will. It would take a fundamental shift in how society viewed accountability and fairness. As he grappled with how to respond, another voice rang out from the crowd. "Governor Carter, what about the anonymous threats against activists? Do you think they're connected to the police?" The question sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. James had heard about the threats, emails and phone calls targeting some of the most vocal protesters and community leaders. But he hadn't expected the issue to surface so publicly, and the implications were chilling. If there was a coordinated effort to intimidate those pushing for change, it meant the opposition was more organized and dangerous than he'd realized. The atmosphere shifted once again, the crowd buzzing with speculation and fear. James' mind raced as he tried to piece together what he knew. Could the threats really be coming from within the police department? Or was there another group, operating in the shadows, trying to sabotage the movement for reform? As these questions swirled in his mind, James made a decision. He stepped closer to the mic, his voice steady but charged with determination. "I will not stand by while people are threatened for speaking out," he said. "Whoever is behind these acts of intimidation, know this: you will be held accountable. Justice isn't just for some of us, it's for all of us." The crowd erupted in cheers, their faith in James renewed. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The threats, the unrest, the deeply ingrained resistance, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, one that he was only beginning to understand. And as the sun set over the courthouse, painting the sky in shades of fiery orange and deep purple, James knew that the real battle was just beginning.